The house creaked around Sarah, an old house settling, her dad would say. But tonight the sounds felt different. Loneliness hung heavy, a thick blanket on a summer night. Her parents were away, a rare weekend trip, leaving Sarah alone, just for 2 nights. The digital clock blinked 11:58 p.m., almost time for bed. Sarah reached to turn off her bedside lamp. That's when the phone rang. Minutes ticked by, the house groaned again. Then the phone rang, the same sharp ring tearing through the quiet. Sarah stared at the phone, her heart pounding. She picked it up, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Hello?" Again, silence. But this time, a new sound. Breathing, heavy, uneven breaths on the other end of the line. Panic clawed at her throat. This was no prank. Someone was there, listening. She slammed the phone down. Her mind raced. Who would do this? Why? The phone rang again, and again, and again. The persistent ringing pierced the silence, each ring fueling her terror. She couldn't take it anymore. Sarah unplugged the phone. The action was simple, yet it felt monumental. The cord slipped from the socket with a soft click, severing her last connection to the outside world. She stood there for a moment, staring at the now silent device, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The silence finally was welcome. It enveloped her like a comforting blanket, muting the chaos that had been her constant companion. But this silence was also heavy, filled with unspoken fears and lingering doubts. But it was a fragile silence, easily shattered by the pounding of her own heart. Each beat echoed in her ears, a relentless reminder of her vulnerability. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm within. She checked the locks on the doors, twice. The windows too, all secure. She moved methodically, her actions driven by a need for control in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. Each lock clicked into place with a satisfying finality. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was an irrational fear, she knew, but it clung to her like a shadow. Every glance over her shoulder revealed nothing, yet the sensation persisted. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window sent shivers down her spine. The house seemed alive, its old bones groaning and settling in the night. Each sound was a potential threat, a harbinger of something sinister. She imagined shadows lurking in the corners of her room, eyes peering at her from the darkness. Sleep was impossible. Her mind conjured up images of unseen figures, their presence felt but never seen. The darkness played tricks on her, turning the familiar into the menacing. Exhaustion pulled at her, but fear was a stronger force. Her body ached for rest, but her mind refused to let go. She gripped the blanket tightly, as if it could shield her from the intangible threats that haunted her. She huddled on her bed, clutching a throw pillow for comfort. It was a small, almost childish gesture, but it brought her a semblance of security. The pillow was a barrier, however flimsy, between her and the unknown. The house creaked and groaned around her, a symphony of unsettling sounds. Each creak was a whisper, each groan a murmur of the house's age and history. It was as if the house itself was trying to communicate, to share its secrets. Every minute felt like an hour. Time stretched and warped, the night an endless expanse of fear and uncertainty. She watched the clock, its hands moving with agonizing slowness, each tick a reminder of her sleepless vigil. The night stretched on, an eternity of fear. She sat in the darkness, her mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking just beyond her sight. The shadows seemed to close in, pressing against her, a silent testament to her isolation and dread. Morning brought little relief. The calls hadn't started again, but the memory of the heavy breathing lingered, a dark cloud over her thoughts. She plugged the phone back in, hoping for some normalcy. Maybe it was over. Maybe she could forget it all. The phone rang. She jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling. This time, a voice. A raspy whisper, barely audible. "I know where you live." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, her blood turning to ice. This wasn't just a prank anymore. This was a threat, and the caller knew her. But who? Her parents' voices on the other end of the line were a welcome sound. Familiar. Safe. She told them everything. The calls, the breathing, the whispered threat. Her voice shook with residual fear, each word a struggle to get out. But their reaction wasn't what she'd hoped for. They sounded more annoyed than concerned. "It's probably just kids messing around, honey," her dad said, his voice laced with amusement. "Don't worry so much." "But they knew where I live," she protested. her voice cracking. "They said it." Her mother sighed. "Sarah, you've been watching too many scary movies, just ignore it, okay? We'll be home tomorrow." The line went dead. Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. They didn't believe her. The phone rang again. This time she hesitated. Was it worth answering? What would they say this time? The ringing continued, insistent, demanding. With trembling fingers, she picked up the receiver. "Hello? You have a beautiful home," the raspy voice whispered. "I particularly like the antique vase on the fireplace mantel. Your grandmother's, isn't it?" Sarah's blood ran cold. They knew about the vase, a family heirloom tucked away on a shelf in the living room. No one, not even her friends, knew about it. The caller had been inside her house. They knew her house, they knew her family. Terror, raw and primal, flooded through her. Her breath caught in her throat, panic rising, her fingers slick with sweat, fumbled desperately for the phone. She had to call someone, anyone. 911. The numbers seemed to blur as she punched them in. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was calm, professional, reassuring, but Sarah could barely speak, her fear overwhelming. Her voice came out in a choked whisper. "Someone, my house, they're calling, they know." The operator's voice sharpened. "Take a deep breath, ma'am. Can you tell me your address, please?" Sarah managed to choke out her address, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "Stay on the line, ma'am. We're sending someone over now. Help is on the way." Two police officers arrived at the scene, their faces set with determination. Their presence was a beacon of hope in the darkness that had descended upon her, a glimmer of safety in an otherwise terrifying night. They listened patiently as she recounted the terrifying events of the past few hours, her words painting a picture of fear and uncertainty. Her voice shook as she spoke, the fear still fresh, the threat still real. Every word she uttered was laced with the terror she had felt. The officers, their faces grim, searched the house with a thoroughness that spoke of their experience in such matters. Every room, every closet, every nook and cranny was inspected with meticulous care, leaving no stone unturned. They moved with a quiet efficiency, their eyes missing nothing, their senses heightened by the urgency of the situation. The silence of the house, once so menacing, was now filled with the reassuring rustle of their movements, a sign that help was at hand. They emerged from their search, shaking their heads in disappointment, their expressions reflecting the lack of evidence found. No sign of forced entry was found, adding to the mystery of the night's events. No indication that anyone had been inside, yet the feeling of an intruder lingered in the air. But Sarah knew the truth. She could feel it in her bones, the certainty that someone had been there. Someone had been watching her, their presence a shadowy figure lurking in the background of her mind. Someone had been inside her home, leaving behind an invisible mark that only she could sense. One of the officers stayed with Sarah while the other made a call. Minutes ticked by, each one an agonizing stretch of time. Finally, the officer returned, his face unreadable. "We may have a lead," he said, his voice low. "The calls. They were made from inside the house." Sarah's blood ran cold. Inside the house, but how was that possible? She had been alone. The officer continued, his voice grave. "There's a crawl space in the basement. Seems there was someone hiding there." "Hiding?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Who would do such a thing?" "Why?" The officer nodded. "We found him. He's being brought in for questioning." He paused, his gaze meeting Sarah's. "It's the handyman, Sarah, the one your parents hired last month." The arrest of the handyman sent shockwaves through Sarah's world. This man, a familiar face, someone her parents trusted, had been the one terrorizing her, the one who knew the details of her home, the one who had been watching her. The police investigation revealed a chilling truth. The handyman had a history of obsessive behavior. He had kept a journal filled with disturbing entries about Sarah, detailed descriptions of her daily routine, photographs of her, taken without her knowledge. It turned out he had a spare key to the house. He'd been coming and going as he pleased, often while Sarah was home alone, unaware of the danger lurking so close. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. The sense of violation was profound. The nightmare was finally over, or so it seemed. The handyman was in custody, facing charges. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing justice had been served. Sarah's parents were back, their faces etched with guilt and relief. They had been away, unaware of the horrors their daughter had faced. The house was deemed safe. New locks, security cameras, and alarms were installed, transforming it into a fortress. But for Sarah, the world had shifted on its axis. The once familiar surroundings now felt alien and threatening. The familiar had become menacing. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind, sent her heart racing. The people she thought she could trust, now strangers. Friends and neighbors, once sources of comfort, now seemed like potential threats. The fear lingered, a constant companion. It followed her everywhere, casting a shadow over her every move. The sound of the phone ringing, once a cheerful sound, now sent shivers down her spine. Each ring was a reminder of the terror she had endured. The experience had left an indelible mark. Her reflection in the mirror showed a haunted expression, a stark contrast to the carefree girl she once was. A constant reminder that darkness could lurk in the most unexpected places. Even in the bright light of day, shadows seemed to follow her. That even in the supposed safety of her own home, she was vulnerable. Multiple locks and security systems couldn't erase the feeling of being watched. The world, once filled with the bright hues of youthful optimism, was now tinged with the gray shadows of fear. The stormy skies outside mirrored the turmoil within her. The silent caller had been silenced, but the echo of his terror still resonated in the silence of her heart. The scars, though invisible, were deep and enduring. Moving is never easy. It's back-breaking work for one. Boxes seemed to multiply overnight. But for John, the thought of unpacking in his new house filled him with a sense of excitement. He was finally on his own, free to build a life away from the crowded city. The house was a steal, a charming Victorian with a wraparound porch and a sprawling backyard. Sure, it needed some work. There were creaky floorboards and the occasional draft, but it was his.
I spent the first few days unpacking and settling in. I explored every nook and cranny of the house, familiarizing myself with its quirks and charms. The basement, however, remained untouched. Its heavy wooden door, tucked away under the stairs, seemed to discourage exploration. I figured I'd get to it eventually. Right now, I had more pressing matters to attend to.
Little did he know, that innocuous-looking door held the key to a terrifying secret. A secret that would turn his dream home into a nightmare. It started subtly. A soft scratching sound coming from the basement one night as John was trying to sleep. He dismissed it as an animal, maybe a raccoon that had wandered in. He told himself it was nothing to worry about. Old houses came with their share of critters, but the noises persisted. Each night they grew a little louder, a little more distinct. They weren't the usual scurrying or scratching one might expect from a stray animal. These sounds were different. They were deliberate, almost rhythmic, like footsteps pacing back and forth beneath the floorboards. John started to feel uneasy. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. The house, once a source of comfort and excitement, now felt oppressive, filled with unseen eyes. Despite his growing unease, John tried to rationalize the situation. He told himself it was just his imagination, the stress of the move playing tricks on his mind. Houses settled, especially old ones. It was probably just the pipes or the wind. He kept himself busy with work and errands, avoiding the basement altogether. He even bought earplugs, hoping to drown out the unsettling sounds that plagued his nights. But the truth was, he couldn't escape the creeping fear that was slowly taking root in his mind. The sounds were becoming a constant presence, a haunting reminder that he was not alone in the house.
I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. I had to face my fears and find out what was lurking in the darkness beneath my feet.
Days turned into a week, and the noises from the basement escalated from whispers to pronouncements. The footsteps grew heavier, more frequent. It sounded like someone was dragging something across the floor, something heavy. Then came the banging, loud, resonant thuds that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. It was as if someone was trying to break free from their subterranean prison. John couldn't ignore it any longer. Fear was a constant knot in his stomach. Sleep became a luxury he could barely afford.
I knew I had to confront whatever was down there. It was time to face my fears. I could no longer live in a state of perpetual dread, my own home a source of terror.
Section 5. Venturing into the darkness. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer, John finally decided to investigate. He took a deep breath and approached the basement door. The air grew noticeably colder as he reached for the handle. The musty smell of damp earth wafted up from the stairwell, sending shivers down his spine. He flicked on the light switch at the top of the stairs, but the bulb flickered and died. Cursing under his breath, he used his flashlight to illuminate the steps. The wooden steps creaked ominously under his weight. The air was thick with the silence of the grave. He reached the bottom of the stairs and shone his flashlight around the room. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and dust covered every surface. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something vaguely metallic that made his stomach churn. Section 6. Trapped beneath the floorboards. The basement was empty. There was no sign of any forced entry, no evidence of any animal infestation, just rows of dusty shelves and cobweb-covered boxes. John felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by a surge of anger at himself for overreacting. He was about to turn and leave when he heard it again, a soft whisper, seemingly coming from right behind him. He spun around, heart pounding in his chest, but there was nothing there. As he turned back towards the stairs, he heard the blood drain from his face as the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the empty space, mocking his terror. Panic seized him. He rattled the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. Section 7. Ticking clocks and mounting terror. Time seemed to stand still in the suffocating darkness. John pounded on the door until his fists were raw and bloody. He screamed for help until his voice was hoarse, but his cries were met with nothing but an eerie silence. He was completely alone, trapped in his own personal hell. The air grew heavy with the smell of his own fear. He slid down against the rough-hewn timbers that supported the first floor. Despair threatened to consume him. His flashlight flickered, reminding him that even his only source of light wouldn't last forever. Hours crawled by. Each tick of his watch sounded like a death knell in the oppressive silence. Just when his hope began to dwindle, he heard it again. This time, the voice was clearer, closer.
Quiet, they'll hear you.
John froze, his blood running ice cold. He strained to pinpoint the source of the voice, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a low, guttural whisper that seemed to slither up his spine and wrap itself around his brain.
Who's there?
John croaked, his voice raspy from disuse. There was no reply, only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of his heart. He shone his flashlight around the basement once more, but the beam revealed nothing but empty darkness. The voice, however, seemed to be coming from behind one of the walls.
Don't be afraid, I'm here to help you.
After what felt like an eternity, John heard the welcome sound of voices from above. Someone was trying to open the basement door. Relief washed over him in waves, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. He hammered on the door with renewed vigor, yelling for help. The police arrived, alerted by concerned neighbors who had heard the commotion. They broke down the door and found John huddled in the corner, shaken but unharmed.
I heard noises, the slamming door, and a voice in the dark.
They searched the basement from top to bottom, but their efforts proved futile. There was no sign of any intruder, no evidence of any wrongdoing.
Sir, there's no one here. Are you sure you weren't imagining things?
John insisted he wasn't imagining things. He knew what he had heard, what he had experienced, but without any evidence to support his claims, the police were inclined to believe he had been the victim of a cruel prank, or perhaps a stress-induced hallucination. Determined to prove he wasn't crazy, John installed security cameras in and around the house. He reviewed the footage obsessively, searching for any sign of the intruder. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was nothing. John began to doubt his own sanity. Then, one evening as he was reviewing the footage from the basement camera, he noticed something strange. A faint outline, barely perceptible against the dark background of the wall. It was the outline of a door that had been concealed behind a layer of drywall.
What is that?
With a growing sense of dread, John grabbed a crowbar and headed down to the basement. He chipped away at the drywall, his heart pounding in his chest. As the last of the plaster crumbled away, he gasped in horror. Behind the wall lay a narrow crawl space, and huddled inside was a figure shrouded in shadow. The figure didn't resist as the police dragged him out into the open. He was a haggard, wild-eyed man, his clothes ragged and filthy. He mumbled incoherently, his words a jumbled mess of fear and paranoia. As they led him away, he locked eyes with John, a chilling grin spreading across his face.
Who are you? What are you doing here?
What is he saying?
He never left. He's still here, watching, waiting.
John later learned that the man had been living in the crawl space for months, surviving on scraps and rainwater. He had been a tenant of the previous owner, an elderly recluse who had died under mysterious circumstances a year earlier. The police had never suspected foul play, attributing the death to natural causes. But now, with the discovery of the hidden crawl space and its occupant, they began to re-examine the case.
I can't stay here. I need to leave.
John never forgot the terror he felt in that basement. He sold the house soon after, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched, that he was not alone. The experience left an indelible mark on his psyche, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that hide. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where kids played on sidewalks and neighbors exchanged smiles. Sarah loved it. Her small house nestled among manicured lawns was her sanctuary, a place of comfort after long days at the bakery. She'd water her geraniums, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. A gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. It was perfect. Or so she thought. The words were simple, conversational. They seemed innocent at first glance, almost friendly, yet they sent a shiver down her spine. The casual tone contrasted sharply with the underlying menace. The writer knew her routine, described her morning jog, her walk to the bakery, her habit of leaving the kitchen light on at night. Every detail of her daily life was laid bare, as if someone had been watching her every move. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. How? Who was watching her? The thought of an unseen observer made her skin crawl. She scanned the street from her window. Nothing, just the familiar rhythm of suburban life. Neighbors going about their business, children playing, cars passing by. Everything seemed normal, yet she felt anything but. The letter ended with a chilling sentence. "I'll be seeing you soon." The words echoed in her mind, a sinister promise that refused to be ignored. Sarah reread the words, her heart pounding in her chest. Each time she read them, the sense of dread grew stronger. Dismissing it as a cruel prank, she tossed the letter in the trash. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a sick joke. But the seed of doubt had been planted. No matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the fear lingered. It gnawed at her, a constant reminder that someone out there knew too much about her. She couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside her window sent her pulse racing. She started seeing shadows where there were none, hearing whispers in the dead of night. Then another letter arrived, this one bolder, more menacing. It spoke of her life in detail, her dreams, her fears. Things she'd never shared with anyone. The writer was watching her, studying her. Sleep became a distant memory. She was living in a nightmare, the walls of her home closing in. The sanctuary had become a prison. The once comforting rituals of her day were now tainted with dread. The morning jog, once a source of joy, became a frantic dash, her eyes darting around, searching for any sign of her stalker. The bakery, once a haven of warmth and the aroma of fresh bread, now felt cold and exposed. Every customer, every passerby, became a potential suspect. The letters kept coming, each one a hammer blow to her sanity. Her once bright spirit dimmed, replaced by a gnawing fear that clung to her like a shroud. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded, Sarah noticed something taped to her bedroom window. Her breath hitched in her throat. It was a photograph of her, asleep in her bed. Terror, raw and consuming, washed over her. The stalker had been inside her house, had stood over her as she slept, breathing the same air, watching her every move. The world spun. Her legs gave way and she crumpled to the floor, the photo fluttering down beside her. This wasn't a game. This was real. And it was only a matter of time before the stalker escalated further. Her home, once her refuge, now felt like a cage. Every corner held the memory of the photo, the chilling realization that she was being watched, even in the supposed safety of her own bed. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboard, every whisper of the wind against the window pane sent shivers down her spine. Her eyes darted to the shadows, searching for any movement, any sign of the intruder. The letters continued to arrive, each one a taunting reminder of her vulnerability. The writer seemed to relish in her terror, feeding off her fear like a parasite. Driven to the brink, Sarah knew she couldn't live like this anymore. She reported the stalking to the police, but with little evidence beyond the letters and the photo, they could offer little reassurance. She installed security cameras, their cold, unblinking eyes offering a sliver of comfort in the darkness. She scrutinized every face, every car that passed her house, searching for anything or anyone suspicious. Days turned into weeks, each one an agonizing dance with fear. The letters continued, but the stalker remained elusive, a phantom haunting her every waking moment. One night, as Sarah huddled in her living room, a flicker of movement on her security monitor caught her eye. She had been feeling uneasy for days, sensing that something was off, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the soft hum of the monitor. Her heart leaped into her throat. Someone was outside her house, lurking in the shadows by her rose bushes. The figure moved stealthily, almost blending into the night. Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Was it a burglar, a lost stranger, or something far more sinister? Adrenaline surged through her veins. She hit rewind, her hand trembling as she replayed the footage. Each second felt like an eternity as she watched the figure's movements frame by frame. Her breath quickened, and she could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. There he was again, a shadowy figure, partially obscured by the darkness. The way he moved was deliberate, almost as if he knew he was being watched. Sarah's mind flashed back to the recent break-ins in the neighborhood, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. But this time, as he turned his head, the security light flickered on, illuminating his face for a fleeting second. It was just enough to catch a glimpse of his features. The light flickered again, casting eerie shadows that made the scene even more surreal. The world seemed to stop. Sarah stared at the image on the screen, her blood turning to ice. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her mind struggled to process the information, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She knew that face. It was a face she saw every day, a face she trusted. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. How could someone so familiar, so close to her, be the one lurking in the shadows? The betrayal cut deep, and she felt a mix of fear, anger, and heartbreak. Sarah knew her life would never be the same again. It couldn't be. It just couldn't be. But there he was, staring back at her from the security footage. Mark, her neighbor. The friendly man who lived across the street with his golden retriever. The man who helped her carry groceries. The man who always had a kind word and a warm smile. The man she trusted. The man who was stalking her. Her mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the two images. The friendly neighbor and the stalker. They couldn't be the same person. And yet, the evidence was right there before her eyes. The realization hit her like a physical blow. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly given way, leaving her in a free fall of confusion and fear. All those shared smiles, all those seemingly innocent conversations had been a lie. Every friendly wave, every casual chat over the fence now felt like a cruel joke, a carefully constructed facade to gain her trust, to get closer to her. The neighbor she thought she knew was nothing more than a master of deception, hiding sinister intentions behind a mask of friendliness. The fear that had been a constant companion now morphed into something even more chilling: betrayal. It was a betrayal so deep that it shook her to her core, making her question every interaction, every moment of kindness. The one person she thought she could rely on, the one person who made her feel safe in her own neighborhood, had been the source of her terror all along. The realization was like a knife to the heart, twisting with every thought of trust misplaced. The world she thought she knew, the world of friendly neighbors and quiet streets, crumbled around her. The once comforting silence of the neighborhood now felt oppressive, filled with unseen threats and hidden dangers. In its place stood a chilling reality, where trust was a dangerous illusion and even the most familiar faces could harbor dark secrets. She realized that the true danger lay not in the unknown, but in the familiar, in the faces she thought she could trust. The neighborhood, once a sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of fear and suspicion, where every shadow held a potential threat. The police arrived quickly, the security footage irrefutable evidence of Mark's sinister obsession. As they led him away in handcuffs, his face remained blank, devoid of remorse. Sarah watched from her window, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The nightmare was finally over, but the scars, both emotional and psychological, would remain. Her home, once a sanctuary, would forever be tainted by his violation. The sense of peace and security, shattered beyond repair. The price of trust, she realized, could be a lifetime of fear. Ten-year-old Daniel felt like a conquering hero. He had always imagined what it would be like to be the man of the house, and tonight, he finally had his chance. The sense of responsibility was thrilling, and he felt a surge of pride as he looked around the living room. Now, his kingdom. His parents were gone, out on a dinner date, and it was the first time he was alone. The house, usually filled with the comforting presence of his family, now seemed vast and mysterious. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every corner a new adventure waiting to be discovered. The house creaked, a symphony of familiar sounds. The old wooden floors groaned under the weight of memories, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the windows. These were sounds he had heard 1,000 times before, but tonight they seemed to tell a different story, one of bravery and courage. He munched popcorn, feeling braver with every crunch, pretending to be the fearless hero of his comic books. Each bite was a victory, each crunch a declaration of his newfound independence. He imagined himself as the protagonist, facing dangers and overcoming obstacles with ease. He glanced at the clock, 8 p.m., still early. The night stretched out before him, filled with endless possibilities. He wondered what his parents were doing, if they missed him as much as he missed them. But he quickly pushed the thought aside, determined to enjoy his solo adventure. He flipped through channels, boredom creeping in. The shows that usually entertained him now seemed dull and uninteresting. He longed for something more exciting, something that would match the heroic narrative he had built in his mind. The power flickered. He jumped, heart thumping. For a moment, fear gripped him and he felt like a small child again. But then he remembered his role, the hero of the night, and he steeled himself against the darkness. Just the wind, he told himself. He took a deep breath, calming his racing heart. He knew that heroes face their fears head-on, and he was determined to do the same. The night was his to conquer, and he would not let a little flicker of light stand in his way. A sharp rap on the front door startled him. He froze, listening. Silence. Must be the wind, he thought, clutching his comic book tighter, but doubt lingered. He tiptoed towards the window, peering into the darkness. Nothing. Relief washed over him, quickly replaced by annoyance. He was being silly, letting his imagination run wild. He went back to the couch, trying to focus on the television. Then it came again. Knock, knock, this time on the living room window. His blood ran cold, his heart hammered in his chest. He pressed his back against the couch, eyes darting around the room, searching for the source. He saw nothing. just the reflection of his own terrified face staring back at him. He was trapped, the house suddenly feeling more like a cage than a sanctuary. The knocking intensified, migrating to the wall behind him. His breath caught in his throat. It was inside the house. Terror, raw and consuming, flooded him. He scrambled back, knocking over the coffee table in his haste. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He had to hide, to get away from whatever was inside the house with him. His safe haven had become a hunting ground. Section 5. Sanctuary. He darted into his bedroom, slamming the door shut, the flimsy lock a meager defense against the unseen terror. He huddled under his bed, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling uncontrollably. The knocking followed, relentless, each thud like a hammer blow to his sanity. He clapped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the sound, the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread that enveloped him. Section 6. In the presence of darkness. Then, silence. He held his breath, listening intently. He could hear it now, a faint scratching sound coming from the other side of the door. Something was moving slowly, deliberately towards him. He squeezed his eyes shut, his imagination conjuring up monstrous forms, each more terrifying than the last. He was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, to scream, to do anything but wait for the inevitable. The room was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver uncontrollably. The dim light from the hallway cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the room feel even more oppressive. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat echoing in the silence. The scratching sound grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side of the door was desperate to get in. He tried to calm himself, to take deep breaths, but it was no use. The fear was too overwhelming, too all-consuming. He could feel the sweat trickling down his forehead, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own fear. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. His eyes flew open and he stared at the door, his mind racing with possibilities. What could it be? A wild animal? A ghost? A demon? The possibilities were endless, each one more terrifying than the last. He could feel his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, his chest tightening with panic. He knew he had to do something, anything, to break free from the paralyzing fear. He forced himself to take a step forward, then another, each one a monumental effort. He reached out a trembling hand towards the door, his fingers brushing against the cold, rough wood. He hesitated, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back, but he knew he couldn't. He had to face whatever was on the other side, no matter how terrifying it might be. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The hallway beyond was empty, the faint light casting long shadows on the walls. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The scratching sound had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He took another step, then another, his fear slowly giving way to a sense of determination. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side. He had conquered his fear, at least for now. But he knew that the darkness would always be there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for its chance to strike. And he would be ready, no matter what. Section 7. Whispers of Fear. A low growl, barely audible, sent shivers down his spine. It wasn't a sound he recognized, not from any animal he knew. It was something else, something ancient and evil. He felt a cold presence near him, the air growing heavy, making it difficult to breathe. The smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and foul, filled his nostrils. Suddenly, the front door slammed open, flooding the house with light and the sound of his parents' voices. The presence vanished instantly, the growling stopping abruptly. He didn't move, couldn't move, still trapped in the grip of terror. His mother found him under the bed, his face pale, his eyes wide with unshed tears. He clung to her, burying his face in her side, the familiar scent of her perfume a welcome anchor to reality. The house, which had moments ago felt like a prison of shadows and fear, was now filled with the comforting sounds of his parents' hurried footsteps and concerned voices. The contrast was stark, almost surreal. His father, usually a pillar of strength, looked shaken as he scanned the room, trying to understand what had happened. The boy's mother, her face a mask of worry, knelt down beside the bed, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out to him. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. He nodded slowly, still unable to speak, his throat tight with the remnants of his fear. She gently pulled him out from under the bed, her arms wrapping around him in a protective embrace. The warmth of her body and the steady beat of her heart began to calm him, the terror slowly ebbing away. His father joined them, his large hand resting reassuringly on the boy's shoulder. "It's all right now," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "You're safe. We're here." The boy looked up at his father, the familiar lines of his face and the strength in his eyes providing a sense of security that he desperately needed. As they sat there, huddled together on the floor, the boy began to feel the weight of the night's events lift. The presence that had seemed so real, so menacing, was now just a memory, fading into the background as the love and safety of his family took center stage. He knew that whatever had happened, whatever he had seen or felt, it couldn't hurt him now, not with his parents by his side. The house, once again, felt like a home. The shadows receded, the fear dissipated, and in its place was the comforting reality of his parents' love and protection. The boy took a deep breath, his body relaxing for the first time since the ordeal began. He was safe. He was home. His parents, initially dismissive, their concern quickly turning to alarm as they saw the state he was in. They searched the house, finding nothing amiss, attributing his terror to an overactive imagination. But then they saw them. Strange symbols, crudely drawn on the bedroom wall, directly opposite his bed. They were unlike anything they'd ever seen before, ancient and vaguely menacing. The symbols were unsettling, defying explanation. They called the police, who were equally baffled. The drawings were photographed, analyzed, but yielded no answers. The symbols remained a chilling enigma. Daniel, despite his parents' reassurances, couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent had invaded their home. The symbols were a constant reminder of the unseen terror that had stalked him. Life returned to normal, but the events of that night left an indelible mark. The fear subsided, but the memory lingered, a shadow lurking at the edge of his awareness. He never truly felt alone again. The locked door, once a symbol of his solitude, became a reminder of his vulnerability. He had faced the unknown, and in its presence discovered a fear he never knew he possessed.